Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome back to the History Shorts podcast, your daily short format history-themed variety show and weekly conversation series with leading voices in history today. Today's conversation is brought to you by thecollector.com, the ultimate online destination for anyone passionate about art, history, and culture. Beautifully curated, easy to read, and perfect for history nerds who want reliable, inspiring content without the fluff. Thecollector.com is just waiting to be discovered. Today on History Shorts, we're exploring one of the most harrowing and revealing chapters of the 20th century, everyday life in Berlin during the Second World War, from 1939 to 1945. Picture this. In 1939, Berlin was already 6 years into Nazi rule. Once a vibrant, liberal, cosmopolitan capital known for its cultural energy, artistic freedom, and relative tolerance in the Weimar era. The city of over 4.3 million people had gradually adopted to the totalitarian grip of the regime. Many Berliners, unlike in more fervent Nazi strongholds, privately held the party in low regard. Yet most made their accommodations, going along to get along, navigating propaganda, restrictions, and the growing shadow of repression. When war erupted with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, astonishingly little changed at first for most ordinary Germans in the capital. Daily routines persisted, work, rationing, blackouts. But the illusion of normalcy held, unless, of course, you were Jewish. For Berlin's Jewish population, life had already been eroded by years of discrimination, exclusion, and terror. Now it descended into hell, with deportations accelerating toward the horrors of the Holocaust. As the war dragged on, the facade cracked. Early victories gave way to defeats. Stalingrad in 1943 marked a turning point. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, turning nights into firestorms and reducing neighborhoods to rubble. By late in the war, Berlin faced relentless raids from above and the looming advance of the Red Army from the east. Amid the chaos, cultural life flickered on in surreal ways. Berlin Philharmonic concerts in damaged halls, people huddled in coats under bomb-packed roofs, clinging to fragments of civilization. Survival became the only priority. The old greetings of Auf Wiedersehen or even the obligatory Heil Hitler suddenly faded, replaced by a stark, pragmatic phrase, "Stay alive." By May 1945, when the Battle of Berlin ended in capitulation and the city's garrison surrendered just days before VE Day, Berlin's population had plummeted by nearly half through death, flight, and expulsion. The once proud metropolis now lay in ruins, vast swaths reduced to rubble, a testament to total war's cost. This is the world captured with extraordinary nuance and humanity in Ian Buruma's new book, Stay Alive, Berlin 1939 to 1945. Buruma, the acclaimed author and historian known for his insightful explorations of authoritarianism, culture, and human behavior, specifically under pressure, draws on diaries, letters, and memoirs, and then crucially, his own father's wartime letters from Berlin, where he was conscripted as a Dutch forced laborer among hundreds of thousands of others. Today, we are thrilled to have Ian Buruma joining us to discuss Stay Alive, the history it uncovers, the personal connections that drove it, and what the dark chapter still teaches us about survival under tyranny. A quick word from our sponsors.
Let's talk about modern home shopping. It's sort of become a fun side hobby, right? Scrolling listings at night, dreaming about kitchens you've never seen, or backyards you haven't even stepped foot in, all from the comfort of pretty much anywhere. Redfin knows a lot of people like you want to own, but are stuck in this browsing mode loop. That's where Redfin flips the script. With listings that update within minutes and tours you can book right from the Redfin app, you can see your dream home the moment it appears. Now, liking a listing is easy, but actually landing it, that's where Redfin comes in. Redfin has over 2,200 agents with local expertise. And Redfin agents close twice as many deals as other agents. That means they want to help you win, not just window shop. Redfin is built to help you go from just looking to wait, this could actually be home. So become the newest neighbor on the block. Visit redfin.com to start finding and start owning. That's redfin.com.
Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So this story has a personal connection to you. Can you tell us the inspiration and what got you started on this particular book?
Yes, I've always heard stories from my father about Berlin when I grew up, and once I started visiting Berlin, I also grew to very much like it. I mean, it's one of my favorite cities, and I've always been fascinated by my parents and their background and what way they went through. So in our family, we never had that situation that you often hear about from people, that they say, "Oh, well, I wish I'd asked my parents this or that," but we were never interested as kids and so on. In my case, it was the opposite. I was always very interested, and so he talked. So I heard lots of stories. I grew up in the shadow of World War II. I was born in December 1951. And anybody who grew up and I don't need to tell you, I'm born in Poland, but anybody who grew up in a country that had been occupied by the Germans was obsessed by it in one way or the other. That it was a sort of moral yardstick, and who'd collaborated, who'd done what, and so on and so forth. So it was a subject that always interested me. And then I found the letters that my father wrote home from the years that during the years that he was in Berlin, which was from the summer of 43 till the very end. And they were very interesting. I mean, the reason he was there was certainly sad. They were also, apart from being forced to work in a German factory, living in a workers' camp, not a concentration camp, but a workers' camp, and being bombed in the end, day and night. There are also the letters from a provincial student, living in a big city for the first time. So it gives you glimpses of what life was like.
Well, as you were discovering and reflecting on these personal documents, how did that shape your approach to broaden out the scope of it and telling the larger story of a city and its people?
Well, I didn't just want to tell my father's story. I thought that would be too narrow. And I also noticed that there are endless books about Berlin, many of them about the Weimar period, of course, and the cabarets and the movies and all that. There are quite a few books about Berlin and Germany in general in the 1930s and the rise of Nazism. Very few books about the war years. And I think one possible reason may be that German historians tend to shy away from subjects that could come across as sort of national self-pity. Because, certainly the second half of the war, it was very rough. So I decided to do that, and the way I conceived it, and it's always very difficult in retrospect to know exactly how you came to do things in a particular way, but I wanted it to be a kind of kaleidoscopic view of what life was like, not just for somebody who was forced to work there, but for collaborators, for resistance, for Jews, for non-Jews, and so on. And the way to do that was, to mix metaphors, but it was to compose a kind of mosaic of newspaper reports and advertisements, memoirs, letters, and so on. One inspiration is one of my favorite novels of all time, which is Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin, who wrote about sort of working class Berlin in the late 1920s. And it was part of modernism to show a big life in a big city as in sort of fragments, in the way that one experiences big city life. You're constantly bombarded with images, with jingles, with commercials, with billboards and so on. And that's sort of the way I thought of doing the book.
Berlin was never a stronghold of fervent Nazism. It had a reputation as quite liberal cosmopolitan city before 1933. How did that pre-Nazi character influence the ways that Berliners navigated or perhaps even quietly defied the regime during the war years?
That's a very good question, and it's difficult to answer because, of course, it depends very much on the individual. But I mean, we see this in our own time. Right-wing populist movements are almost invariably against the big cosmopolitan cities. I mean, the big cosmopolitan city stands, whether it's Berlin or New York, Paris, stands for everything that right-wing populists hate because they're mixed, they're ethnically mixed, they're very competitive, the wealth is concentrated there, it's full of foreigners and modern art and so on and so forth. So the Nazis never liked Berlin, they didn't trust the Berliners. Now, how the Berliners responded, that depends. I mean, there were opportunists, there were Nazi fanatics, there were resistors, there were people who in private complained but wouldn't have done so in public. And as is true in all dictatorships, most people tried to keep their heads down and survive it as best they could.
As we're turning the pages of Staying Alive, as readers, you get this sense of like you're witnessing a city from its height slowly descend into hell, be the right terminology, especially after 43. How does Berlin and its people perhaps showcase as a microcosm of the overall German experience, war experience, and perhaps where does it distinguish itself?
I would say it's less a microcosm of the overall German experience than it is a microcosm of a general experience when cities are subject to strategic bombing. And I mean the following, that the idea of strategic bombing, which I believe dates at least back to the 1910s and possibly earlier. I mean, the British used bombs as a form of terror to crush rebellions in the empire, particularly in the Middle East. But the idea that was developed, sometimes called strategic bombing, sometimes called terror bombing, and so on, is that if you bomb the civilian population hard enough, you'll create such chaos and demoralize people to such an extent that they'll turn against their leaders. And the way that the Berliners responded was very, very similar to the way that the Londoners responded, or people in Tokyo responded, or people in Hanoi during the Vietnam War. They didn't do that. The morale does not get destroyed to the extent that they rise up against their leaders. On the contrary, it creates a kind of London can take it attitude. And Berliners were no less stoical than the Londoners were. And also, when you're all being threatened by something like that, you rely more on the authorities. It doesn't mean that you like what the authorities stand for, but you don't rebel against them because they're the ones who are in charge of food distribution and shelter and that kind of thing. So I would say Berlin was no different from other cities, including the Allied cities that were heavily bombed.
One thread throughout the book is the Jewish experience in Berlin during the war. Even as deportations are continuing, how did you balance portraying the broader city's survival strategies with this unique terror and precariousness faced by those still remaining in the capital?
Yeah, that of course was not easy. People often forget, they often think that because the Nazis made such a thing of their war against the Jews, that there must have been an enormous number of Jews in Germany at the time. Of course, there never were. It was never more than about 1% of the population, I think. I mean, it was a relatively small number. But the crime and the scale of the crime and the way it was carried out and so on is so monstrous that you have to pay a lot of attention to it, even if it didn't affect a very large percentage of the population of Berlin at the time, or indeed other parts of Germany. But most Jews were in Berlin, as most Jews in Austria were in Vienna, or in the Netherlands were in Amsterdam. So Berlin was associated with Jews, even though it was a small percentage. And so I felt that in order to bring the story to life, I wanted to rely very much on first-person account from memoirs, interviews, and so on. And I wanted to have several Jewish characters who would tell the story through their experiences. And most non-Jewish Berliners, even though they knew that terrible things were happening, some of them didn't really want to know what was happening in more detail than that. Some of them did, but most of them would have been relatively oblivious to it.
There's a lot of mixed examples. There's some solidarity, ambivalence, and action towards the Jews. There's obviously different people do different things, but it seemed that some of the early war trying to help the Jews, it all kind of shrinks. This moral courage under terror shrinks throughout the war, as the war progresses, right?
Yes, but I think that's probably less a question of people's attitudes to Jews changing as it was that the more the war came to Berlin itself and the more people felt threatened and in danger, the more preoccupied they were with their own survival and not so much with people who had been suffering already for more than a decade. And so to the extent that there was a lot of hostility to Jews, it's possible that it was actually worse in earlier periods than it was later.
Would you say that as Berlin moved toward defeat, did people experience the fall of the regime as liberation, tragedy, or simply the end of this unbearable uncertainty?
I think probably the end of the war itself. I think that many people, um, as the end of the war neared, and as they realized that Germany was going to lose, they were terrified of the consequences. They were terrified of what the Russians might do, and so on. And of course, when the bombing got really bad, and the last Battle of Berlin was horrendous, all most people wanted was for the war to end. And that was not so much a protest against the Nazis or Hitler, even though there was more and more grumbling about them, because they, quite rightly, were blamed for getting people in that predicament in the first place. But I think they just wanted it to end. And then, of course, things were still very tough. And the actual end was extremely tough.
Surprisingly, I guess, or not surprisingly, there are a lot of different people that are still alive from this time, and you got a chance to talk to some of them. What surprised you the most while you were compiling this research throughout the process? What you came across, whether it was in an interview or a reading, a diary, or anything along those lines?
Well, it's difficult to say because the accounts were so varied, and people had obviously have very different memories. But one thing that did, I don't know if the word surprised is the right one, but that struck me was for how long many people could pretend that things were relatively normal. And the people that I was still able to interview were, of course, all children during the war. And many of them had memories that sort of suggested that until the late stages of the war, things are just, well, that's the way life was. And of course, that's the way children always experience life, however hard and grotesque the circumstances. Children adapt. And if you were a Jew in the terrible circumstances of living in a ghetto in Poland, it would have been extremely unpleasant, but you would have, again, if as a child, you would have thought, well, this is normal. This is what life is like. And so the word normal cropped up a lot in these interviews.
It's interesting you say that because the book kind of describes this outrage under autocratic regimes often becomes normalized over time. Kind of today's outrage is tomorrow's normal. What insights does history, in this case, perhaps in Berlin from 39 to 45, offer about how ordinary people learn to look away or adapt to moral catastrophes? And maybe do you see any parallels in other historical events or perhaps contemporary societies?
Well, I see parallels, even though I haven't been to Russia since the war in Ukraine. But I certainly, from what I gather from Russian friends and what one reads, there are parallels between Russia today and Germany in the Third Reich. which is that Goebbels did everything to make it easier for ordinary middle class and upper middle class Germans who were not Jewish to feel that things were sort of okay. There was a lot of entertainment. They were better fed than most people in occupied countries. For a long time, he did everything to make it seem, again, that same word, but as that things were relatively normal. And he very consciously did this in the same way that Vladimir Putin appears to be doing this. If you're an ordinary person in Moscow, you have enough money, or Petersburg, life is okay. The cafes are full. You can go to the cinema. The museums are open. There's plenty of good food, and shops are full of good things. And so you don't have to think about the war in Ukraine if you don't want to. And I think there's a clear parallel there, which is very different from, let's say, Stalin's Soviet Union, because Stalin's purges were so not only very widespread, but so whimsical in a way. I mean, anybody could be caught up and be sent to the Gulag or executed. And so there was a constant state of terror, which I don't think was true for many Germans and for much of the time.
I'm curious how the Germans reflect on this time period of the war years, particularly Berliners. Since that time, I mean, we're not 100 years quite yet, but because, as you mentioned, people are still alive. But how do you think, perhaps just based on your experience, Berliners feel about that history? Is this something that they are now revisiting? Is this something that they want to forget? How is the attitude toward this time period today?
Well, one shouldn't generalize, of course, but I think it changes with time. And that's as true probably of Berlin as it is of other parts of Germany, in that in the 50s, people were so busy rebuilding the country, rebuilding their lives, they didn't really want to deal with it. And there was also a sense of shame and guilt that had to be suppressed. And so the people tried not to think about it or talk about it. It was with the generation that came of age in the 60s, the children of the people who experienced the war as adults, that began to rebel against their parents in ways students always do, but that included, and in this way, Japan is the same as Germany, indeed Italy, that included what the parents had done during the war. And it was the 60s generation that felt that they had to resist the establishment, capitalism, whatever it may be, Zionism, because the parents did nothing in their view. And so the most radical left-wing student movements in the world were in Germany, Japan, and Italy, which is not for nothing. And so there was a lot of attention paid to the war all of a sudden. And the people who were in education, school teachers and so on, of that 60s generation, certainly in West Germany, East Germany is a different story, but West Germany did an awful lot to keep the memory alive, to remind people of what happened, warn them against it not happening again. And that's when a lot of monuments were built and movies were made, novels were written about the war, to the extent that maybe people now who are under 30 or under 40 feel it's enough. We've been bombarded with this stuff, but again, that would depend very much on the individual.
You mentioned this idea of West, East, Germany being so different. As a child, I remember driving through East Germany and leaving Poland and going to visit West Berlin. But as we drove through East Germany, it did not feel any different than Poland. It was poor. You had a lot of Fiats and Vladas. It was like another Poland until you went through the checkpoints and you got into West Berlin. And all of a sudden it was like, whoa, it was like a different world altogether.
Yes, the big difference to East and West Germany was that in East Germany felt that they were the anti-fascist Germany, and that they were the ones who, along with the Poles and the Russians and others, had fought against the fascists. And so they were the good Germans. And there was far less emphasis on the Holocaust, specifically on the Holocaust, and much less about the war as a warning against it not happening again, which in West Germany really comes down to the Holocaust. It doesn't come down to the invasion of Norway or anything like that. It's the Holocaust, and that played a far less important part in the way history was educated in East Germany. And in East Germany, it was the same as in Poland. I mean, in Poland until not so very long ago, when Poland was communist, and you went to Auschwitz, there was very little mention of the Jews. It was all the victims of fascism. And that was the same in East Germany. And since East Germans saw themselves as the anti-fascists, they didn't have to feel guilty in the same way that West Germans did.
That's an interesting point.
What an original thought.
So, Ian, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm thinking about a lot of things, and I'm not yet really stuck in.
Not settled, yes. Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining me today. This really was amazing. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
In Ian Buruma's new book, Ian Buruma, in Ian Buruma's new book, Ian Buruma